Ladies and gentlemen, a very good evening to you indeed. My name is Alistair Chapman, for those who are not familiar, and I am the chairman of the Wellington Trust that hosts these monthly heritage lectures. You're very welcome, one and all, and for those returning, thank you so much. For those who are new to it, thank you very much indeed. It's going to prove to be, I think, a very interesting evening, a very non-mythological subject with a mythological title, Here Be Monsters. The monsters, I think, will become all clear as our guest speaker tonight, Lieutenant Commander John Blake, FRIN, Royal Navy and Royal Naval Reserve, explains. Just one or two quick housekeeping notes for those who are perhaps not familiar. We will be mute during the lecture and off camera. But towards the end of the lecture, if you want to stay on and chat, just remain where you are with your sound on or off as you wish, but and your cameras on, and you will be brought in. Our absolute top-line wizard, IT man, Matt Egger, will be bringing you in one by one. So it might take a few seconds for you to come in, but don't despair. You will be brought in if you're still there. And it'll be good to have you afterwards. We always enjoy and learn quite a lot from those follow-up sessions. As far as the lecture itself is concerned, we're taking questions. At the bottom of your screen, you should see a Q&A button. If you'd just like to link onto that, you will be able to type in your question. And Fiona Sparks, our trust manager, will be collecting those questions during the course of the lecture. And at the end, Jenny Mosley, our marketing trustee lead, will be hosting the questions and answers session with John. There will be a recording of this lecture as ever, and that should be available up on our website, which is thewellingtontrust.org, possibly from tomorrow night, but certainly from Wednesday onwards, as are all our other past lectures, I'm glad to say. Anyway, with no more ado, let's move to the topic. Dear John Blake, who I've known for many years, long-standing friend and a fellow member of the City Naval Club, John has an interesting life. He was born in Tenbury in Pembrokeshire and spent much of his childhood here, and indeed he is back in Pembrokeshire, where he lives now. As I said earlier, he served in the Royal Navy and in the Royal Naval Reserve for nearly 16 years as an executive seaman and navigating officer, obtaining the rank of Lieutenant Commander. In his naval time, he served extensively in seagoing ships, and he also qualified as a Navy underwater diver and as a naval air defense specialist. Useful man to have around, John, you are. On leaving the service, he gained a business diploma and moved into the retail sector, opening 3 retail stores in Covent Garden in London, Boston, Massachusetts, and later in Osaka, Japan, featuring exclusively British gift products. In 1991, John and his wife Francine started an intellectual property licensing agency, Classics Licensing Company. In 1996, they initiated and ran the licensing of the United Kingdom Hydrographic Office, the producer of charts. And this archives for 6 years under the brand name of the Admiralty Collection. The UKHO, the Hydrographic Office, produced the internationally acclaimed Admiralty Sea Charts and were the custodians of an extensive archive of historical sea charts, such as Captain James Cook, Matthew Flinders, William Bligh, George Vancouver, and medieval Neptunes, sea atlases, and maps, which have subsequently been relocated to the National Archives. John is a very keen maritime historian and a very able one, I know, having had 5 books published and contributed to 3 others. He writes regularly on maritime history for maritime magazines and has given talks on sea charts and exploration for more than 26 clubs and societies. In 2009, he was elected as a fellow of the Royal Institute of Navigation, FRIN, and is a member of the Society of Authors. And just for the record, if I may, his 3 books on charts of the sea chart, sea charts of the British Isles, and charts of war, and very, very excellent publications they are as well. I have them, all but one. John, no more ado. Everyone's heard enough from me. Over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Alistair, for a very flattering introduction. I don't know that I deserve it, really. We start off with a slide from the Scandinavian Institute Tessin, actually based in Paris, which shows in 1539 the idea of sea monsters that were prevalent in the Scandinavian seas. This was by a Scandinavian cartographer called Olaus Magnus. And translating the writing to the bottom left, it says, among the family of sea monsters, the spouter is a leviathan, 300 foot long, has been given a nature that is totally forbidding. In order to destroy, sailors often rise above the yardarms of vessels and spouts forth the waves it has sucked up into the tubes above its head in such torrents that it frequently sinks the stoutest ships. With its weight, it throws itself onto a ship's prow or stern and presses on till the vessel sinks down and becomes submerged. There is a deterrent, however, that they recommend, and this is to throw casks overboard for the monster to play with while sounding from the poop with a trumpet. This is an example of the more mythological aspect of charts. But I'd like to quote Arthur C. Clarke, who said that how inappropriate it is to call this planet Earth when it is clearly ocean. And over 2/3 of our planet, our precious planet Earth, is actually covered with water. And the means to communicate and bring trade between the continents has relied on the sea for centuries. And so the sea chart has been a vital part of the ability of these ships to get across, whether it's for exploitation, for exploration, for colonization, for taking land from indigenous and so on. We know the history of the last 5 centuries. Navigation is therefore a means to an end. But what did they know in the very early days? This slide shows what is known as a T&O map, Orbis Terrarum. It's 7th century, and the scholar they were usually clerics, because the church had the opportunity to investigate these things, was Isidore of Seville. And he shows 3 known continents. I don't know if you can see my pointer, but Europa, Africa, and Asia. And they were, in their view, populated by descendants, relatively, of Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Aristotle had divided the spherical Earth into zones of climate, with a frigid clime at the poles, a deadly torrid clime near the equator, and a mild and habitable temperate clime between the two. And to the north of Asia was considered the Garden of Eden. It is currently on display actually at the British Museum, if you're interested. And it dates back to 700 to 500 BC, which was found in a town called Sippar in Iraq. This shows the world map from Sant Sever Beatus, dates about 1050 AD. And it was ordered by Gregory de Montano, who was the abbot in the Duchy of Gascony near Paris. and it coincides with the First Crusade. And going from left to right, you've got east to the left. They didn't pay attention to what we now regard as the normal convention of north to the top of the page, the Mediterranean in the middle, and Jerusalem in the middle of the Mediterranean, of course. This was actually also kept in the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris. Interestingly, the word orientation comes from the Orient. In 1154, the Norman king of Sicily had a map drawn of the known world by an Arab called al-Idrisi, who astonishingly had traveled to France, England, Italy, throughout the world. He was brought up to be curious about the world. And King Roger of Sicily was the son of one of the Normans. It wasn't just England that was invaded in 1066, but the Normans spread out through Europe and conquered Italy and Sicily as well. So this was drawn from knowledge obtained by al-Idrisi at the instigation of King Roger, and it's now known to be in the famous Book of Roger, dated 1154. If you look at this illustration, it's a bit of a puzzle. But if I show you the next slide, you can understand what we've got. And now you can see that we've got the Mediterranean here, if my arrow is pointing, and the Red Sea going out to a very diminished India and what was known as Ceylon, with Africa coming across the whole of the known world, and England, a very diminutive, or Britain, a very diminutive country to the north. It shows with reasonable accuracy, but al-Idrisi had explained that the earth is, in his writing, is round like a sphere, and the waters adhere to it and are maintained on it through natural equilibrium, which suffers no variation. It remains stable in space like the yolk in an egg. Air surrounds it on all sides. All creatures are stable on the surface of the earth, the air attracting what is light, the earth what is heavy, as the magnet attracts iron. He had a good insight into what scientists later would know to be the facts. So he didn't, like so many, follow the geographical convention that we know, and north was pointing to the bottom of the page. This is actually on display in the Bodleian Library in Oxford University, which is where I saw it. We come on to the next illustration, which is a profoundly important one. This is in the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, and it's known as the Kartik Pizani because it was found in Pizan 100 years ago or so, but actually dates to 1275, and it's the earliest known navigational chart in the Western tradition. I don't know how much you can make out, but I'm trying to indicate, I'm trying to indicate Italy, which is in the middle there, and you've got North African coast to the bottom and Europe to the top. And it follows what became a conventional design of Portolan charts, as they were known as, which is the Mediterranean method of navigation, whereby you have two center points. Sorry, I didn't mean to flick off. I'm trying to indicate that on the chart. And from those two center points, you have 32 what are called room lines, RHUMB, which are lines of constant bearing, unchanging bearing, which formed a graticule, if you like, a lattice work on which to draw the chart. And what is extraordinary about this chart is that it's within 4% accuracy of what we know the Mediterranean to be today. One has to ask the question, is this the progenitor of charts or is it the antecedent? Because it begs the question, how was such knowledge available then and what went before that has been destroyed or lost? The French king, Saint Louis, also known as Louis IX, sailed in 1270 from the salt-producing port of Aigues-Mortes in the south of France to Tunis. And we suspect that this chart would have been used. My wife Francine and I were very privileged when we went to the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris to be allowed to actually go to the secret part of the archives, and the curator there pulled out the drawer and allowed us, with gloves on, to actually look at this chart, and it was an extraordinary moment for us. But things moved on, and this illustration is by the Venetian cartographer Zohan Pizani, and shows the west coast of Europe, if you can see it. So we've got England and Ireland, and coming down to Africa and what was known as the Straits of Hercules, that's where Gibraltar is. And the style of the portland is such that they always put the main ports in red and the smaller ones in black. And they named every single one. That's why you've got all these names along the coast. It shows Madeira, Canaries and the Azores, and it was the first to depict the Antilla island group, which actually are fictitious, with 7 cities out in the Atlantic. But I, again, have to ask the question, are they fictitious? Because up to the north on this chart, adjacent to Ireland, I don't know if my arrow is pointing, is an island called High Brazil, HY Brazil. And it coincides with a high point on the Atlantic ridge, as do the Antilla island group, which are down here, if that's showing. Did they know more than we know now, or than we suspect they knew then? It's a tantalizing question. This one I got from James Ford Bell Library at the University of Minnesota in Minneapolis in the United States. But there was a very different sort of navigation between that in the Mediterranean and that in the North Sea. The Mediterranean used the portolan, used lines of bearing, understood about latitude, whereas the northern technique was to do coastal navigation with a rudder, typically 30 miles a day, going from headland to headland or port to port or whatever. So it was a different technique. I would say the Mediterranean one was more sophisticated. And this is an example of an Isolario, or navigational instructions, written in verse by Bartolomeo Zambertti, which are called sonetti. This is in 1485. And the Mediterranean sailing used the predictable winds, the Mistral, the Tramontana, Bora, Gregale, Meltemi, Gilby, Sirocco, Levantine, which always blow consistently in the same directions, although not mercifully at the same time. So they knew that the Mistral would coming off the mountains of France and the Alps would be dry but cold, whereas the Sirocco off the Sahara would be hot and dry. And they could use that as a means of checking their position and their course. This particular one shows the directions to get to Rhodes, and it is one of 44 such drawings in a bound book. And round the circle going outside, you've got the ancient symbols for the winds, derived, I think, from the Greek alphabet initially, with north this time satisfactorily pointing to the top of the page. But they had rocks shown, they had significant navigational objects that could be seen. And it became the first, as I say, the first printed navigational instructions. You've got a scale at the bottom, and having it in rhyme enabled the pilot to remember the directions more straightforwardly. This one, actually, I found in the Royal Geographical Society. This is quite an extraordinary chart. It's called the Cantino Planosphere. It dates 1502. It covers the 4 voyages of Spanish and Portuguese discovery: Columbus to the Caribbean, Pedro Alvarez Cabral to Brazil, Vasco da Gama to East Africa and India, and the brothers Corte Real to Newfoundland and Greenland. This was actually copied by Alberto Cantino, hence the name Cantino Planosphere, who was a diplomat in Lisbon. And John le Carré didn't write about him, but he could have done, because he was actually covertly copying this for the Duke of Ferrara in Italy. This sort of knowledge was terribly secret. This intelligence was important. The Spanish, and separately the Portuguese later, didn't want people to understand how to get to these important places. The Spice Islands producing ginger and silk from China, tea, and all the fantastic spices from these small islands like Banda. The routes to them were, they tried to guard them because they were worth a fortune. But they spied on each other and they gave this away. Now, this one is actually held in the Biblioteca Estensa Universitaria in Modena, or Modena in Italy. Of interest, if you can see, this is what happens when I try to indicate, sorry, is that down the bottom, you've got these parallel lines across the chart, which are indicators of scale, because they hadn't discovered how to represent a spherical planet onto a flat surface. That was done later, which I'll explain by Mercator. But what did happen was that the Spanish and the Portuguese were constantly trying to outflank each other to claim more land, particularly in America, North and South, for their countries, because there was gold, there was silver, there was slaves, there were all sorts of things, and people and explorers could make their fortune. So they went to the Pope to decide how they could allocate the world, which is pretty grand. And the Pope at the time was one of the Borgias, and he said, right, I'm drawing a line, it's going north-south. And at the time he drew it in, I think it was 1494, it was called the Treaty of Tordesillas. he drew this line straight down, north and south. At the time, they didn't realize that Brazil bulged out towards Africa into the Atlantic. And this line cuts across Brazil. And that's why, to this day, Brazil is Portuguese and the rest is Spanish speaking. Other things to note on this old chart are you can't see them, but there's fantastical representations of camels and crops and a beautiful compass rose in the middle. And we'll move on to the next slide. And this one is known as America's birth certificate. It's 4.5 feet by 8 feet. It's actually held in the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C., and it's by a cleric, a German scholar, cleric, and master mapmaker called Martin Waldseemüller. And he wanted to draw in 1507 what was known, I keep trying to point and I go to the wrong slide, apologies, wanted to know, to show what was of the known world. And you can see quite a lot of America's east coast is known and the Caribbean, but not much else. And it's known as America's birth certificate because he adopted the name, the first to use the name America. And this came about because, and we'll see a Portland chart in a minute, the explorer Vespucci had done 3 voyages to America, and his nephew, Amerigo Vespucci, of course, who was born in Florence and was a friend of the Medicis, moved to Seville in 1492, and he sailed in 1501 to the Caribbean, to Rio de Janeiro, Rio de la Plata, to Patagonia, and was a very skilled cartographer and astronomer. And he was appointed the first pilot major of the Casa de Contratación in Seville, which is where the Padron Royal, that's the master chart of the known world, was kept in secret in Seville on behalf of the Spanish royal family. And he would brief anybody who was going to the New World, as it was designated, on where to go and where to find it. And Martin Waldseemüller knew that Amerigo Vespucci had actually discovered America proper rather than Columbus, who found the Caribbean. Columbus didn't realize that it was anything else than India and Asia, but Amerigo Vespucci was the first to deduce that America was America and not India. So Waldseemüller named on this map here America's birth certificate as America after Amerigo. Now, of course, continents were feminine: Asia, ending in A, Europa, Africa, so it had to be America. And that's why we have America named today. There was still a lot of interest in finding the New World from the Turkish, the Persians, if you like. And this map is by a Turkish admiral called Piri Reis. It's his world map of 1513, which is actually in the Topkapi Museum in Istanbul. It's only half, and to the right you can see the coast of Africa, and to the left you can see the continent of South America, and interestingly, Antarctica coming up almost to join South America. Whether this was a guess or whether he drew this, as some suspect, from an earlier chart that had been drawn by peoples who had explored that part is not known. But it's interesting that Antarctica along the bottom extends round to the right and almost joins up with South America, which is not actually that inaccurate. The ancients, including the Greeks, believed that the planet Earth had to have a huge southern continent to counterbalance the land to the north, the land encompassing Europe, North America, Asia, and so on. And that's what fueled exploration later to discover this land and claim it for whichever country could discover it first. So that's actually very interesting, although somewhat conjectural. And if we could find the other half of that map, it would be amazing. But we move on now to, I mentioned Amerigo Vespucci, who had deduced that South America must be a new continent. And this is a chart drawn, a Portland chart drawn by his nephew, Juan Vespucci, in 1526. And if you ever go to the Hispanic Society of America in New York, which I did, as you come in, there is this amazing Portland chart, 8 foot by 3 foot. And it was drawn for the Charles V, intended as a gift on his marriage to Isabella of Portugal in Seville. The chart at the top in the middle, you can see the Habsburg coat of arms. And the planisphere itself displays 2 circles in the typical Portland style of 32-point compass roses and intersecting room lines emanating from the compass rose across the entire surface. And Spanish and Portuguese flags are used to reflect the territorial claims and the sea routes based on the disputed line of demarcation I made earlier by the Treaty of Tordesillas of 1495. He rather amusingly added, which is hard to see unless you can expand amusing little details such as camels and elephants in Africa, and the Tower of Babel collapsing in the Near East. And of course, the Red Sea is always at this time colored red, unsurprisingly. This is another example of a Portland chart dated 1537, again in the Hispanic Society of America, which shows the North Europe from Gibraltar to the top of Scotland. And it's by a well-known cartographer from Ancona in the Adriatic Sea in Italy, dated 1537, Conte Hoctomano Freducci. So you've got centers of cartography in the main, initially in the Italian ports like Venice and Kona and so on, and then later, of course, in Seville and Cadiz. This one I had mentioned earlier shows High Brazil again, and the Antilles were Antilla was faithfully reproduced for about 2 centuries in many maps, although they weren't known to exist. But High Brazil is just off the coast of Ireland there. And as I said earlier, it coincides with a huge projection in the Atlantic Ridge. It also shows, interestingly, Scotland completely separate from England, with a seaway, which is, I suspect, as some of the Scots would like it to be. However, we'll move on. This was also in the Hispanic Society of America. This is part of a book of some 20 charts from the Venetian Giovanni Battista Annesi, dated 1559. And this particular one has the typical Portland construction, if you can see it, of these 16 compass rows with 32 room lines coming out from each, meeting the central compass rows between Brazil and Africa, although it doesn't actually have any dedication, which so many of them did. It shows Scotland as being separate again, and the Red Sea is shown as red. And the typical Portland construction technique, of all the place names marked along the coastline. Again, from the Hispanic Society of America, although the Hydrographic Office also has a copy. This is a picture of Gerard Mercator, 1539, known as the father of projection, because he first published his world map in 1569, but he was the first to incorporate the projection that we know today, which allowed for latitude and longitude to be shown such that if you draw a course on it, you wouldn't be following a course which would be the Great Circle. You would be plain sailing. And plain is spelt P-L-A-N-E, but our term, oh, it's all plain sailing, comes from that, spelt slightly differently. An extraordinary feat to be able to realize how to put a spherical design onto flat paper. And he was able to glean information from this Flemish cartographer, Petrus Bertius, of 1578, who constructed this world map from Ptolemy's Geographica of about 150 to 160 AD, which showed latitude and longitude. Unfortunately, this concept was lost with the fall of the Roman Empire, but Ptolemy's great work, known as the Geographia, with 8 books, including an atlas of the world, gave the latitude and longitude of some 8,000 places. So this was, as I say, lost with the fall of the Roman Empire. But in 1400, a Greek manuscript copy was discovered in Constantinople, in which Ptolemy laid down the principles of a projection that so profoundly influenced Mercator. This one actually resides in the Westminster Abbey archives. Interestingly, they decided on a longitude meridian of 0 degrees going through the Canary Islands, whereas today, of course, it's through Greenwich by international consent. On here, we can see India and Ceylon have their relative sizes reversed. And Africa is a huge continent, which at the time, a lot of cartographers thought, doesn't show it here, extended east across to make, you can see on the right-hand side, the land joining to Africa. They thought that the Indian Ocean was landlocked. But interestingly, the original measurement of the Earth's circumference at 18,000 miles was by Eratosthenes, also a Greek, who was able to realized that when he was in the Sahara, the sun was overhead and there was no shadow at midday. And he then went north 60 miles and got the angle, was able to realize from that the size of the Earth, which he put at 25,000 miles, whereas the actual figure now is 21,639 nautical miles. But it does give maps a distortion on the length of the degree of latitude, because 50 miles was used rather than 60 miles, 60 nautical miles. But nonetheless, it had a supreme influence on world mapping and charting. Moving on across the centuries, we're now looking at the known world in 1542 by what's called the Diep School, a French cartographer called Jean Rots. This one is actually in the National Maritime Museum, and was drawn by one of his associates in the school called Nicolas Delien. But interesting was that Jean Rots was Henry VIII's hydrographer and then deserted and went to Henri II, taking with him a lot of these charts. Of course, you probably by now have realized that this is, to our perspective, upside down, and has a lot of land around Papua New Guinea, East Timor, joined to Australia. And it shows at the tip of South America, Cape Horn, the top of Antarctica. They were beginning to understand what the world looks like. This is in the National Maritime Museum. And around this time, England was getting very envious of Spain and Portugal and was trying to find its own colonies and lands, to the extent that Spain decided they would have to invade England, convert us to Roman Catholicism, and teach us a lesson. And Thomas Cromwell, who of course was Chancellor to Henry VIII, around 1540, ordered a defensive survey of England's south coasts from Land's End to Exeter. And this shows the land around Plymouth with existing forts and proposed forts, with notes on fortification and so on. And this one is rather beautiful. It extends to the left and the right a large distance and is in the British Library. And this was the time of such mariners as Sir Francis Drake, who needed to navigate well, and he came across, which is held in the Pepys Library in Magdalen College, Cambridge, the pocket tide tables of 1548, which he obtained from a Breton pilot, Guillaume Bruscon, and he was able to use it for his attack on Cadiz in 1587, when he singed the beard of King Philippe of Spain. But you can see the other pages in this notebook have tide tables and times and so on, and instructions of how to work out high tide in various ports in North Europe. Of course, Samuel Pepys was the naval controller, if you like, under King Charles II. But apologies, because this actually is out of context, chronologically speaking, and we didn't have time to adjust it. But we're going to go on 100 years to 1684, and this is a visual chart or a pilot's guide of Callao, which is the Pacific port for Lima in Peru, which is one of 146 charts or guides from the Spanish Derrotero General del Mar del Sur, as I say, 1684. Again, this is held in the Hispanic Society of America. It's rather beautifully done, and whether the ships are engaging each other with gunfire, I'm not sure. But the rest of the book has more conventional charts. And this was an extraordinary document to come into the hands of the English, because Spanish dominion had been supreme. And the last thing the Spanish wanted to allow was the ability for the British to attack their Pacific ports. So this was, if you like, highly secret. And it was the British buccaneer Bartholomew Sharp who had captured a Spanish ship called the Trinity and was able to fly false colors and capture another Spanish ship called the Rosario off the coast of modern Ecuador in 1681. Amongst the loot that he found was this Derrotero, Spanish book of sea charts and sailing directions covering from Acapulco down to Cape Horn. Quite extraordinary. It was to blow open the secrets of the approach to the Spanish settlements. And Bartholomew Sharp was the first Englishman around Cape Horn, west to east. And he describes how he took his jewels back to London, meaning this book. The other jewel was, he writes, a young lady of about 18 years of age, a very comely creature. This was copied by William Hack, who was the platmaker. Platmakers was the term for cartographers at the time, from Wapping, of the Thames School of Chart Makers, and it was translated from the Spanish and presented by Sharp to King Charles II, just in time to save him from the hangman's rope and receive an acquittal for piracy. King Charles actually made him a captain of the Navy, but dear old Sharp couldn't give up his old way of life, went back to the West Indies and back to piracy. But these were the first reasonably accurate charts of the Pacific in England, and very useful intelligence for British sea rovers from an expanding maritime nation, and were partly instrumental in opening up this coast. Again, this is held in the Hispanic Society of America. Continuing how navigation progressed, here we have a book of charts. It's the first printed sea charts by a person who was in the Zuider Zee. He was a pilot and customs officer, Lucas Janssen Wagenheyer, forgive my pronunciation, 1587. He kept meeting seamen and captains and masters of ships coming back from exotic places, decided that he must get this information, which he produced in this rather beautiful form. He was the first to use navigational views. If you look at the top, you can see he drew how the land would look if you were sailing a ship and approaching from seaward. Whilst he used the traditional Portland construction of a compass rose with the room lines, he was the first really to introduce things like buoys and beacons, anchorages and rocks, and harbors with depths in fathoms on the half flood or the ebb tide, and navigational marks. And he covered from Scandinavia right down to Spain with this extraordinary book, all beautifully illustrated. And 1587, the English got hold of a copy and reproduced it in English just in time to give out the relevant parts to the defending navy against the Spanish Armada. It was, in its way, again, groundbreaking redesigning of information for mariners. And this one's actually held in the Netherlands National Archive in The Hague. And the name, the Dutch name, gave rise to what became the name for sea charts at the time. They were called wagoners. You can see from wagenaar to wagoners was the literal translation. Moving on, we're now looking in 1598, a Portland chart of Africa and part of Spain and the Pillars of Hercules, or the Straits of Gibraltar, as we call them. And there was a certain tendency with cartographers that the less they knew, the more they embellished. And this is certainly true to a certain extent of this map, because the beautiful compass roses do take up a lot of the space. Domenico Vigliarolo was from Naples, and he, as so many of them did, went to Seville to work for Spain at this time. Spain was, after all, the superpower, and he became royal cosmographer to the King of Spain. And this would have been presented to the King of Spain. Again, this one is held by the Hispanic Society of America. But we're going on now to the beginning of the 17th century, when Britain and France were vying with each other to try to find an alternative route to the riches of the Far East, and the Northwest Passage, or the Northeast Passage, must be an obvious one to try. But Samuel de Champlain, who drew this chart, was the trusted agent for King Henri IV of France. And he drew this chart in 1607. He went on to found Arcadia and Quebec. But in fact, over to the left, I can't show you because my arrows don't seem to work, is the site of Boston. And of course, France at the time were laying claim to much of North America. And this particular map is rather beautifully done, is in the Library of Congress in Washington, as is the next one. And can you see what this shows? Because to the right is north, and there's somewhere called Manatus, which may not mean a lot, and it didn't to me until I investigated. And in fact, this is a Dutch chart of Manhattan. And you can see in the middle is Staten Island and the North River, or Nort River. And it's done by a Dutch cartographer called Johan Winkenboens, or Johannes Winkenboens, in Amsterdam in 1670. At the time, Manhattan, or Manatus, which is a North American indigenous name, was a trading post, a fur trading post, and was really seen as very little value. However, the Banda Islands, where nutmeg was traded and brought from Asia, along with other spices, was infinitely more valuable. And the Dutch agreed to swap Banda Island for Manhattan. So Manhattan became British at the time. Well, history will reflect on whether that was a worthwhile swap or not. I mentioned Samuel Pepys earlier, and this is a portrait of him. Just to remind you, he was one of the very much involved in Magdalen College, Cambridge. And when he died, he gave all his papers to what is known as the Pepys Library. And you can go and see these if you ring up and make an appointment. And whoops, we're not moving on now. Oh, there we are. Success. Sorry about that. An example of what's in the Pepys personal collection is this chart by a cartographer called John Sellers of the Cape of Good Hope, dated 1675. And you can see he was trying to give a navigational view there. You've got Table Mountain, and then you've got a chart below of the Cape of Good Hope, Cape Buena Esperanza, with a scale. And they always put little ships in to give another idea of scale, which is rather charming. But it wasn't terribly accurate. And Pepys realized this, and he got to hear of Captain Greenvale Collins, who was hydrographer to King Charles II. And he asked him to do what has become known as Great Britain's Coasting Pilot, comprising 48 charts, published at the time by Richard Mount. And this one actually shows the Thames estuary in 1684. Beautiful work. And inset is, from our perspective, the wrong way around. You've got the North Sea to the left and London City to the right. And then the actual main chart with a beautiful ship in the middle shows to the north, to the right. And I was very pleased to have found this in the Worshipful Society of Apothecaries in London. And my friend, well-known photographer Keith Hammond, actually came in and took a photograph of this, which is now in my book, which I'm grateful, because nobody who couldn't get hold of a copy officially. And moving on now, I spoke earlier how some buccaneers were privateers, were pirates, or were officially naval officers. And there was quite a thin grey line between the two. This is a navigational view of the Canary Islands drawn during William Dampier's voyage to New Holland. He was asked to captain a ship 1699 to 1701 to find out more about what was then called New Holland, Australia. He had a mutiny, he survived that. He got back, his ship sank in the final few months, an extraordinary voyage. Lord Byron wrote of him, he was the mildest mannered man who ever scuttled ship or cut a throat. And I heard the other day that Churchill used this to describe Lord Lovat, who commanded the paratroopers landing at Caen to secure the D-Day bridges. But you can see that actually Dampier's work was very well done, and these navigational views showing what you see when you approach from a certain bearing, and then a view on top, were surprisingly accurate. So he might have been both a pirate and a naval officer, but the book he wrote described the flora and fauna with incredible precision and excited a lot of interest in what was to become Australia. One of the big problems, of course, was to find your longitude position. Latitude was fine. You could take a sextant angle at midday and work out from that what your latitude, but longitude, you needed to know the time at your base, nowadays Greenwich, as well as the time locally, and then you subtract the two, divide by 60 nautical miles to get your longitude. And one thought was that a way to find your your position would be to measure the isogonic magnetic lines, if you like, across the world. And this is what Edmund Halley did in 1700 in the Western Atlantic. He was the only other civilian to be given a command of a Royal Naval ship, the Paramour Pink. And it ended a bit disastrously, quite honestly, because he fell out with his first lieutenant and had him court-martialed. But of course, Halley went on to greater things as the Astronomer Royal and so on. But they discovered that the magnetic variation changed year by year. So this actually was a useless way to try to find out your position. But there's the chart, and it's in the National Museum at Greenwich, National Maritime Museum. This is a very picturesque chart, but it represents a disaster. And it's in the National Archives in Kew. In 1707, Admiral Sir Cloudesley Shovel had been supporting Prince Eugene at Toulon to support the king against an uprising. And he'd had some success, and he was sailing back to receive the approval of the king at the time. And the weather turned really foul. He had 21 ships. And as he was approaching the Scilly Isles, which this chart represents, he actually didn't know what his position was, whether he was north or south. He was guessing. And the story is that a very experienced, able seaman had the temerity to come up on deck, put his knuckle to his forehead and said, "Sir, I think you're standing into danger. We are very near the Scilly Isles." And Cloudesley Shovel turned to him and said, you arrogant whatever, and had him hanged for insubordination. But the sailor was right. And Cloudesley Shovel lost 3 ships onto the Scilly Isles with 1,647 men. And this is actually what gave rise to Parliament to approve the Longitude Act with a prize of £20,000, which was eventually won by John Harrison with his extraordinary clock H4, which can be seen in the National Maritime Museum, and a copy of which, K4, produced by Arnold and Kendall, was taken by Captain Cook. Of course, the moves to explore the Northwest Passage, there were many, many expeditions. And this one represents one of them, Captain Middleton, who tried to get through to Hudson's Bay in 1742 in HMS Furnace. He failed and returned. He failed because there was actually no way to get through. But this chart shows where he tried, and he records fierce tidal streams. But armchair explorers back in London accused him of dereliction of duty and said that there was a way through and he should have gone ahead and found it. And he spent, poor chap, the rest of his life trying to refute that. And they said that his tidal stream information was indication that there was an opening that way through to the Northwest Passage. more locally, there were all sorts of people who were concerned about the loss of shipping. And I think about 7,000 wrecks are on the shores of Great Britain. And Lewis Morris was a customs officer based in Anglesey, but he had a flair for cartography. And as customs officer, he was constantly hearing about the difficulty that skippers had in finding their way around the coast. So he decided that he'd do a private survey of the Welsh coast, which took him 6 years, and he produced 25 plans with sailing directions, confident that the Admiralty would refund him the cost. They never did. But this is an example of one of his charts, Milford Haven, and they're really rather beautifully done. Milford Haven, of course, is one of the most important deep water harbours in the North Sea area and the British Isles. This one is actually held by the Dean and Chapter of Westminster and Westminster Cathedral. Benjamin Franklin, before the American Revolution, was in charge of the post between Britain and America. And he noticed that the American steam packets would beat the British ones by about 2, maybe 3 days, because the American steam packet captains knew from their cod fishing relatives and friends that there was this stream that propelled you from America to Britain 4 or 5 knots faster than if you sailed outside of it. And he drew this chart to demonstrate it, but at the time it was ridiculed, as being misinformed, to say the least. And his wisdom in trying to advocate a faster passage was disregarded. This is held in the Library of Congress in the USA, Washington. Let's go to the Far East for a wee while, quickly. And the Hydrographic Office was set up in 1805, and Alexander Dalrymple confidently thought, having been the East India Company hydrographer, that he would be selected to carry out the voyage to find the great southern continent that in fact Captain James Cook was given. But Dalrymple became the first hydrographer, and they were encouraged, and one of the dividends of peace after the Napoleonic War was that the British Navy had a lot of ships, a lot of very experienced captains, and they were to be employed charting and finding and producing accurate navigational directions and instructions for the main sea routes that were involved in British trade, with Britain being by that time the leading country in terms of colonization and trade. And this is an example of, in my view, a rather beautiful painting of Nagasaki, 1801, the Dashima trading post. I'm sorry, this is wrong. This is actually a navigational view of Nagasaki, as I say, but it's 1866 by the master of HMS Swallow, Mr. Wiles, and they were encouraged to draw these beautiful approaches from which the office then in London, now in Taunton, would take the rudiments and produce like a block diagram to go on the charts. And this is a Japanese chart of Nagasaki about 1801, showing the Dashima trading post, which is to the left. Of course, the Japanese at the time wouldn't allow general trading. They only allowed Western shipping to come to this one place where trade and money were exchanged. This is in the National Maritime Museum. And we're going to look very quickly at Chinese charts of the coastline. This is the coastline of Fujian or Fujian province, 1890 to 1910. And you can see how the Chinese at the time represented their littoral, their seascape, if you like. And this is in the Admiralty Library manuscript collection in Portsmouth. And it's more of a sort of literal interpretation. And this is another example. And a third one, just to give you a feel for how they did it. So we're coming towards the end of my talk. I've got some examples here of Gujarati pilots dated about 1790. They followed the idea more that the Romans did of a sort of left to right itinerary route, covering the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden. And you can get an idea of how they did that. And I just wanted to cover, as I come to the end of my talk, three of the most important British explorers as Captain Cook. He did when he was master of the HMS in Northumberland, I'm sorry, he drew this harbour picture of Halifax in Nova Scotia, as you can see in the Admiralty Library collection. And you can see how well his drawing looks. He learnt very quickly, having been born to a Scottish farm labourer and a Yorkshire mother, and joined the Navy as an able seaman, but through sheer ability rose very quickly and was given 3 captaincies: the Endeavour, the second voyage was the Resolution, the third was Discovery, which rather sums up his character and his career. Just to give you a further feel for his work, this is the final one that he did of Newfoundland, and he learnt a lot from an Army Lieutenant Samuel Holland at the end of the 7 Years' War, the fall of Louisburg, who showed him how to use a plane table, as well as the techniques he'd already learned. And we'll just press on quickly. Here's an example of an indigenous chart. It's actually the Pacific, and it shows how the Polynesians regarded navigation more in a DR style, as in the Mediterranean, with intuition. It shows 2 chains of island, actually, some 100 miles apart, and overall stretching about 500 miles. And just to remind you, from 2500 BC, the Polynesians migrated from New Guinea to New Zealand and the islands around Hawaii to the north. Another hero of mine is Admiral William Bligh. And we all know how he suffered from the mutiny on the Bounty. The Admiralty had sent him out with only 1 ship, no Royal Marines on board. He wasn't actually a flogging captain. but after Tahiti and the wonders of the Tahitian women there, it was hard to maintain discipline, and they didn't want to go back. And this shows the breadfruit thrown at Bligh with his loyal men, 18 of them, when they were cast adrift in a 22-foot open boat with very little provisions. And on the way, Bligh, who had previously been with Captain Cook and learnt his trade there in the third voyage, and this is his chart of Tonga Tapu Island, the Friendly Islands, he did this extraordinary open boat voyage in 1789 after the mutiny. And you can see he covered 3,618 miles in 42 days, and even surveyed islands and discovered the Fiji Islands en route. Quite extraordinary. This one's in the Hydrographic Office. Another extraordinary explorer is Captain George Vancouver, who had sailed with Captain Cook and learned his trade there on 2 voyages. And he actually was able to chart over a 3-year period something like 1,500 miles of the west coast of Canada and North America, and quite rightly, the island of Vancouver is named after him. And thirdly, we look at Captain Matthew Flinders, who was the first to circumnavigate Australia. He had studied under, if you like, under Bligh and Cook, so the techniques were passed on. And this is a chart held in the Hydrographic Office showing his circumnavigation, which was between 1798 and 1803. He put into Mauritius on the way back with his charts, little knowing that there was war again with France, was incarcerated for 5 years. But that's another story. This track chart shows the sloops HMS Carcass and Racehorse attempts to find the Northwest Passage. I described earlier in 1773 how important that was, to see if we could find that. And this is notable because one of the people who helped draw this chart is somebody called Horatio Nelson when he was a midshipman. And that's in the UK Hydrographic Office archives. I spoke earlier about the navigational views, and these are rather beautiful ones done by Captain, later Rear Admiral William Smythe of the Mediterranean, and they would be used for navigational views incorporated into the charts, and they're held in the National Maritime Museum in Greenwich. And finally, we've got an example more up to date of Shackleton's charts showing his furthest south achieved on the 9th of January 1909 at 88 degrees 23 minutes south, but beautifully drawn charts. That was his first trip, of course. So I'd just like to finish with reading an adaptation from Lewis Carroll, The Hunting of the Snark, which I find quite amusing, about charts. He had brought a large chart representing the sea without the least vestige of land, and the crew were much pleased when they found it to be a chart they could all understand. What's the good of Mercator's, North Poles and Equators, tropics, zones and meridian lines? So the captain would cry, and the crew would reply, they are all just conventional signs. Other charts are just such shapes with their islands and capes, but we've got our brave captain to thank, so the crew would protest, that he's brought us the best, a perfect and absolute blank. Thank you very much.
John, that was magnificent. It was a marathon effort. And I think I can fully understand there is no way of giving us that story in any shorter period than you've done. And I thank you enormously for what you've done. I would commend, and I'm going to spin still further his book, John's book, The Sea Chart. I have it. It is a fantastic coffee table size book. and is one for contemplating. And you literally will sit there with pages open in front of you, just looking at them, saying, "Gosh, how marvelous!" And John's description alongside is, as we've heard today, terribly, terribly informative. I do thank you, John, enormously for that. We've I think had few questions, but I think in a way you've covered it by answering everything otherwise would do that otherwise people would ask. But there's just two I had. One was flat Earth versus round Earth or spherical Earth, and it's interesting to see that back in 150 AD, someone was already suggesting that that actually pre-Mercator type projection suggested that the Earth was spherical. I just wonder when that question of the flat Earth society being roundly defeated happened. And the other point, which is rather more interesting, is Chinese navigation. Back before, long before the Spanish and the Portuguese, particularly the Portuguese, were active. Is there much known about Chinese navigational methods going back 1,000 years?
Well, to answer the first question first, the Chinese were the first to understand how the compass might be used. And of course, it was then imported along the Silk Route to Ancona in Italy at about 1275, which is when the first chart that we know about, the Kartik Pizani, is seen. And the voyages of, I've got to remember his name now, Zheng He, is it, who sailed south, reputedly got as far as America, but that's debatable, but certainly got to the tip of Australia, would have used navigational techniques. They understood that they could see their way by looking at the stars, by looking at the sunset and midday. Yes. Remind me your first question.
Oh, it was flat Earth versus spherical.
Flat
It's
Earth.
not so important at all, but it was just I'm making an observation.
Yes.
That 150 AD chart, which is fascinating.
Well, that knowledge was lost, as I said, with the fall of the Roman Empire. And I think principally the church was leading education of people, and they had to have an answer, and they didn't understand the extent of the earth. I mean, if you look from the Suez Canal down, you can see the curvature of the earth.
Yeah.
But at that time, they had to have an answer, and the best answer was, it's a flat earth.
Yeah. Easily, and they were wrong. We won't talk about Brexit. But John, thank you very much. Now, Jenny, may I hand over to you?
Yes, you may. I've got a question here from Doug Holden. Did the Vikings make charts?
That's interesting, because I could talk quite a long time about the Viking navigational techniques. They were able to use quartz, which refracted light, even though they were cloud bound. So they could tell where the sun was, and therefore the midday where south was. But Leif Erikson was reputed to have found North America in the 11th century. But we don't know of any actual charts that they have, but their folk tales record, and they were able to tell people how to get to the various destinations like Iceland and Greenland, which they populated, by looking out for the main navigational hazards and landmarks.
Thank you. And I've got a message for you from Bob Crawley. He says, John, thank you for your talk and excellent books. I have a copy of an 1845 survey of the River Devon by Owen Stanley, E.K. Calver. It seems to be a survey rather than a published chart and has a great deal of detail. My question is that in the bottom right-hand corner, a reference L5429, and underneath an unclear price 5 or press 5, it doesn't appear in the list of Admiralty charts. My guess is that L5429 is a reference, L for litho maybe, and the other part, press 5, number 5, perhaps different presses had different properties. Is this a reasonable guess?
I don't think I can really give you a reasonable answer. I think the Hydrographic Office would answer that. If he wants to email me, I can give him the name of the curator of the Admiralty Library, who could probably give him a definitive answer. Yeah, I don't have that much detail.
Thank you, John. I want to do a plug for our next lecture before we bring everybody in for chatting. It's the annual Shipwrights lecture on the 8th of November, and it's about the Jubilee Sailing Trust's 3-masted bark Tenacious, her construction and 21 years of round-the-world service. So this is being given by Howard Mackenzie Wilson. We'll send you an invitation in due course, of course. And as ever, I do my plug for donations, please, because we're trying to build up our education output at the moment. So every penny is very welcome. And if you've donated, as I know some of you have, thank you so much.
So it just remains with me, John, to thank you once again for a fascinating talk. I knew well from the books that it was going to be very interesting and very detailed, and what a fascinating subject. And gosh, one thinks about human courage in the concept of these sort of navigations of the unknown, and the way that these charts were produced so rudely in some cases. We are now at the end of the formal part of our lecture this evening. We do hope that we might see you and hear you again next month. And John, from your point of view, I think there's going to be another book we're going to ask you to come and talk about, but that's a non. But now, if anybody would like to stay on, we'll just let our hair down, as I say. I might even get around to taking my tie off. So if you want to stay on, and we'll bring us into the huddle at the end. Thank you all very much indeed for attending. Good night. There we are. On we go. Now, John, we're waiting for your brother to come on from South Africa.
Ah.
I'm sure he'll be there. There's Holly over in the States. Ah, our friend.
Hi, Elstar. Hi, John. Hi, Fiona. Hi, Jenny.
Lovely to see you, Holly.
John?
You've got to mention.
Wait, my camera's not on. Wait a minute. I got to get my camera on here.
Yeah, you've got to get your camera on.
There we are.
We've got you. Hi, Holly.
Hi, everybody. John, I want to thank you so much for that talk. That was so interesting. I'd love to see your Titanic book, because I am Miss Titanic, you know. And also, John, I would like to tell you of interest, you would be interested in knowing where I live, Kenosha, Wisconsin, which is 50 miles directly north of Chicago, Illinois, at Lake Michigan. My apartment windows face looking east at Lake Michigan, and so I can look out and see the boats in the harbor at the marina and walk across the street to the boats. You can imagine. And
fantastic.
Yes, so thank you again, John. Very appreciated. Wonderful lecture, and thank you also for mentioning Newfoundland and the other port city, the other nautical maps in Canada, because you know it is Canada Thanksgiving Day today. No, I'm not Canadian.
My wife is.
Gotta get that plug in, you know.
My wife is Canadian.
Oh, really? Where's she from?
She's French Canadian from near Montreal.
Yes.
But I can send you, I can email you details of the Titanic book if you want.
Oh, thank you. I'll appreciate that very much. Merci beaucoup. Thank you.
If you drop me an email, if you've got it.
Yes, I can give it to you. If you do you want it now or?
Yep.
No, okay. Oh, you're gonna love this one. All small letters. Pickle, Pickle, Lake, Lake, Ontario,
Yeah,
at
yeah.
yahoo.com. Let me make sure I do that right. Pickle Lake, Ontario, at yahoo.com. And no, I have never been to Pickle Lake, but that's what I chose.
Okay.
I thought you were on Michigan.
And surprisingly, no one in the town wanted that email address.
That's very good. That's great to see you, Holly. And
Good to see
David.
all of you too.
Yeah, great to see you. And
Good to
David,
see you.
welcome back to the show. Fantastic. Your brother did a great job this evening.
I can certainly say that he's got endurance, and we don't need to talk about Shackleton. But
I will raise hand or chat. Keep that up. Keep it in.
that was an amazing story, and
They
the
don't
work
drop
still
it,
goes
don't drop it
on.
down.
I think with where
Don't want to drop it below there. Keep it there.
this man Menzies, who's written his book, and we need to understand the DNA, the traces that have been found in all sorts of parts of the world. But anyway, that's another story too.
Yeah.
Oh, that's fascinating. I particularly thought there was a resonance seeing Table Mountain, which actually looks just like Table Mountain. It's fantastic. That little drawing, although the ships were slightly out of scale, and I think probably the Cape is a little bit further away than was suggested by that drawing. But what a beautiful piece of artwork that was. Gosh,
David,
nice to see you.
David, looking forward to seeing you sometime after the 21st of October.
That's
indeed, coming over, or is he going? Are you going over there, John? Both of you.
He's coming.
Alistair.
Yeah.
I will be actually in town. I've already penciled in the 8th of November. I will be in town in the London area. So I took the plunge when we got off the red list. And I booked my ticket.
To keep the pointer in there.
Yeah. I tell you what, Diana and Stephen, could you put your mute on for a second, because you're slightly over speaking David. David's
sorry.
late. That's all right. Don't worry, Diana. We'll speak to you in a minute, my dear. There we are. You're going to be here on the 8th of November, David, are you?
I am indeed, yes. As John said, I took the plunge anticipating that South Africa would come off the red list.
Yeah.
And bought my ticket, and I'll be there from about the 20th of October until just a little after the 8th of November. So that was a guess.
Fantastic.
But see what happens next month with your talks.
That's on Monday, the 8th of November.
And that's your next event.
That is absolutely right. It's going to be well spotted, indeed. Good. I'll liaise with John on that, David, and see what can be done. Solomaz, good to see you. David Hogman, other David, good to see you. Good evening. Lovely to see you all. And Sasha, this is a new one. Do we know you, Sasha? How do you do? Welcome to the huddle. Are you there? You're on mute at the moment, I think. Yeah, you're still on mute, but it's good. We can see you talking.
He's my son.
Oh, really? Oh, fantastic. Oh, that's brilliant. Whereabouts are you? Or where is he? Because I think he's on mute still.
Cardiff.
Yeah. Great. Great to have the family on, indeed. And Stephen and Diana, it's great to have you here as well. Stephen, you're looking remarkably younger in that picture.
It was taken a month or two ago, I think.
Well, absolutely right. But I tell you what, Stephen, you would put that one back in the pile. You might be on the short list for the next Bond, actually. So well done.
I'm keeping on.
Yeah.
I must say, if I could say something to John, ever since we started these heritage lectures, which was about 7 years ago, I don't think I've been more enthralled by one particular talk than tonight.
I would.
John, it was brilliant. It really was.
I would echo that very much. It was fantastic. It really was. And Richard, are you still there? Richard Clark, or have you just dropped off? My old colleague in arms. He's gone. He's gone. That's all right. He would have enjoyed that, though. He's a great sailor. And Angela, nice to see you again, as ever. And Solmaz, great to have you on board.
Thank you. Great to see you all.
That's lovely. And Barbara, and Barbara Baggett, who's on mute and off camera, but we see your name. Great to have you. And Roger Francis. Roger Francis, yep, CMMAR, who I think, there he is. That's great. Good to see you again. I hope you enjoyed that.
And of course, we've got John and Barbara.
We've got John and Barbara, without which nothing is possible. Come on. I think it's terrific.
Losing our connection tonight, so it's been a bit intermittent.
Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry about that.
So we need to get back on board.
We do, but remember, you can actually see the recording again, Barbara. So
yes.
yeah, sure. So there should be no problem with that, which is good. Well, I think, I don't know what you, Diana, nice to see you, just perched around the corner. There you are. I hope you're well. Looking after your old man. You're both on mute now. You're famous. You're on telly, Mum. There you are. Anyways, lovely to see you both. I reckon, I don't know, we are now at 8:05. And someone was saying something. Yeah, no. I think we're 8:05. I think on this occasion, it was a long lecture, but it was a good lecture. And it needed to be that long. And John, you covered an awful lot of ground. But I think
sorry if I banged on.
No, you could bang on as much as you like, because it's all good stuff. It was terrific. I'm looking forward. Don't forget to send me, please, that book, and I will bung you lots of money. You'll write post books, or do you want to drop it up next time you're up in London? It's entirely up to you.
Not sure when I'm next in London, but we can work that out. Can Holly just say hello to my wife, Francine? Francine from French Canada. Holly from
Hi, Francine.
Hello.
Nice to meet you. A pleasure to see you.
Yes.
A pleasure. A pleasure. A pleasure. And Francine, I'm going to tell you that I have I've taught myself how to do ATM banking in the French language.
Oh,
I mean, I don't speak or read French, but I can read certain words, and the ATM machines are all rigged up in English as the same in English as in French. So I do it in French, and I feel wonderful when I do it. I just
hopefully it stops the scammers.
Yes. Alistair, there's a message from Richard Clark, which he did. He says, thank you, John. A great history lesson of science, art, espionage, and exploration. And I look forward to the next edition.
Well, there you are. You've got two more to do. One on the charts of the British Isles and one on the charts of war. Actually, John, can you give us a resume on the charts of war? That one I found very interesting. I've got a copy of it here. I don't know if people can see it. Does it? I'm not sure if it's going to actually behave. No. It's in my hand.
You have to put it near the camera.
Do I do that? No. That's not getting. No, it's not making any difference. It's actually being very secretive, which is very appropriate for a chart of war. But you cover all those centuries as well with that book. Well, I think you do.
The idea was to cover the navigational charts and give an account of not necessarily the major maritime battles, but certainly some of them, but also some lesser known conflicts from the Greeks and the Romans right through to D-Day. And indeed, I finish at the Falklands War, where my great friend, who I don't know if he tuned in, Captain Nick Tobin, who is captain of HMS Antelope, famously sunk in Carlos waters by the Argentinian Skyhawks.
Yeah.
He survived, quite rightly got the DSO. He contributed his personal charts to me, which I've included in the book. So there are charts of maritime conflict.
Yeah.
Across the centuries. Yeah.
There's a a message from your son, John, from Sasha.
Oh, right.
Thank you for the webinar, Dad. Very interesting. Unfortunately, my iMac, the microphone is not working with the app, so I cannot connect my microphone. However, I enjoyed the webinar very much. Well done, Dad. Sasha, kiss, kiss. Quite appropriate.
That's very nice.
That's my poor chap. Hi, Sasha. Well
Thank you,
done.
Josh.
It's really good of you to send that message. Now, Stephen, you're off mute, and you're about to say something.
Just, I would like to say something about projections.
Yeah.
Because, John, you covered the different projections, and we all got confused when we saw something upside down or west to east rather than east to west. But during the Cold War, we discovered that the Russians had been using a projection of the Atlantic for all their projected anti-convoy operations. And it started with Archangel and North Cape right at the bottom of the map and spreading out into the Atlantic. And I tried this at the Maritime Tactical School, and we got such a different view and understanding of how the Atlantic worked than just looking at the conventional chart. And it's something we're not used to doing. And when we're on board in the courtroom, there are those 3 charts, Dutch charts, on the left-hand side as you go into the courtroom, which was done it was done for Admiral de Ruyter when he started ransacking London and coming up the Thames.
Yes.
And they start, forget east, west, north, south. You start where you are at the bottom, and where you're going to is at the top. And you get such a different understanding of the geography.
Very interesting. Yeah.
It's interesting. What was interesting as well, John, was I didn't realize that rum lines, or ROM lines, call them what we will, were such an ancient invention. Because the navigation, do you remember going across ocean, we would actually steer off at an angle and alter it so many miles. So we were actually apparently going a longer course actually to go a shorter way.
Yes.
Something even to this day, I really can't get my head around.
Not following the Great Circle. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. It's quite extraordinary. Yeah. Wow. What an evening. I think I need a drink after that just to recover. Shall we call it a day again, or anyone else going to? I'm happy to stay on as long as anybody likes. Jenny,
I have to go, I'm afraid. So I'm going to drop off.
That's a good call point, I think. Probably say let's call it an evening.
Thank you,
Thank you all
Jenny.
for coming.
Thank you, Jenny. Thank you, Fiona. Thank you, All-Star and John, Francine.
And
Thank
John,
you.
it was a great one.
Have a
Thank
good
you very
night.
much indeed. Bye, Francie. Bye bye.
Everyone.